Hello, everyone. Glad to have you with us again for our Sunday Bible study. Coming to you here from University Assembly of God Church in Waxahachie, Texas. And we are right in the middle of, getting closer to the end of, a series on the life and ministry of Jesus. And so last week, we covered the areas of number 10, 11, and 12 in our outline. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, a week before that he was going to be crucified and then resurrected. And this is because of them throwing palm branches and proclaiming him to be King of Kings. This is sometimes called Palm Sunday. And the rest is the story of Jesus during this 1 week. And we said that 30% of the gospel accounts are about this 1 week leading up to the crucifixion. Then we talked about the Jesus ministering in the temple. He drove the money changers out of the temple, and then he was there day after day teaching people that were coming into the temple, and also performing healings, and people would bring sick people to him and he would heal them. And this happened day after day during this week prior to his crucifixion. And then the last of the week, Jesus celebrated this last Passover celebration with his disciples. And that's where we left off with our discussion last week. And so today we're going to move on to talking about the events in the Garden of Gethsemane. And also we'll be talking about the so-called trials that Jesus was put through before the religious leaders and the political leaders. So let's get into it right here, go ahead and get into it. Last week, as we concluded, we talked about how that after the Passover supper, Jesus took his 12 his disciples, except for Judas. Judas had gone out earlier and was out in the process of betraying Jesus. And Jesus took his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is on the Mount of Olives, just outside of the city of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley. And all four of the Gospels tell us about these events. And this was, Jesus took them to a place where he often went to pray. All four Gospels give us information about what happened there in the garden that night. In Matthew chapter 26, Mark chapter 14, Luke chapter 22, and John chapter 18. Several, as you can see here, several verses giving the information here. And this is a lot of that story that's of the last week. During that time in the garden, Jesus warned his disciples about what was about to happen. And he foretold them that they would all flee from him. Now every time he would say something about this, they would all deny that they would forsake him, especially Peter. Peter vowed that he would never forsake Jesus, no matter what was coming. And remember, Jesus has been telling them at the Last Supper with them. He's been telling them about his death that was coming. But he told them that they would all flee, and so he admonished them to pray so that they would not succumb to temptation. And we're going to see what happened with regard to that. And we all know the story of how Peter did end up denying Jesus, even though he said he would not. Mark is the only one that tells this, says that Jesus took Peter, James, and John a little further, where he confided in them, saying, "I am grieved to the point of death." Can you imagine this? Jesus is becoming more and more aware, has become very, very much aware, I should say it that way, I guess, that he's going to suffer a gruesome death. Uh, uh, Remember that crucifixions were done quite often in the Roman society, and they were always done in public view. And so Jesus had seen this. Jesus knew what it was to be crucified, and he's coming to this, and he knows what's going to happen. And so this is probably kind of an understatement. I'm grieved to the point of death. While I would not necessarily call it a panic attack, I could well guess that Jesus was feeling something like that. What does he mean when he says, I'm grieved to the point of death? So this was very, very troubling to Jesus, and it appears that the disciples are hearing him, but they're not hearing him. That happens to us a lot. We hear, but we don't really get it. And so he asked Peter, James, and John to watch, and the implication is also to pray, while he went a little further to pray by himself. And so Jesus leaves them there at that place and tells them, like I say, to watch and pray. And then he goes and begins to pray alone. And all three of the synoptic gospels record Jesus' prayer there in the garden. Can't you just almost hear it? Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. This is very, very interesting here. The relationship of Jesus, the Son, to the Father, and what is happening here. And in my opinion, Jesus was stating a fact. All things are possible for God the Father. The fact of the matter is, God did not have to do this for us. He could have just not done anything, or he could have done something else. And Jesus, in his humanity, is praying that if there's some other way, surely God, there's some other way. Father, there's some other way. Remove this cup from me. And yet he says, not what I will, but what you will. And Jesus, it's hard to think about this in a way, because you have to try to separate his humanity and his divinity, and you really can't do that. But just remember that Jesus was experiencing this in the fullness of his humanity. He was experiencing this in the fullness of his humanity. And he's thinking, surely there's some other way. And I think in his humanity, he doesn't really know. And so he just has to yield and say, God, if there's not any other way, then what you will is what I want. And that's what he finally came to. And, we have to be willing to do the same thing. Certainly not in the same kind of circumstances that Jesus did here, but we have to be willing to accept God's will, even when we don't understand things very much at all. And only Luke, who was a physician, says that he was in such agony that his sweat became like drops of blood. We're not totally sure what all that means. I do notice that Luke was a doctor, and Luke didn't say that his sweat became drops of blood. Some have suggested that, but I do not know if that's even possible. But others have suggested that the term "like" here is very important, and it might be something like it was just pouring off of him. He was sweating so badly, it was just pouring off of him like blood would be coming from a wound. Instead of just dripping, it was just flowing off of him. But anyway, what we do know is that Jesus was in terrible, terrible agony. And if he thought that he was grieving to the point of death a few minutes before, when he was talking to his three close companions, this only intensified and intensified and intensified as he was seeking his heavenly Father for some other solution, possibly. And also, only Luke tells that an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. I wonder what all that was. One thing we know is the angel didn't come and tell him there actually is some other way. Um, I don't know. Perhaps the angel simply said, assured him that God the Father was looking down and seeing what he was going through, and that the angel is basically saying something to the effect, possibly, that you'll make it. God will help you. You will make it, and you will make it through and be victorious. So, in some manner, the angel came and ministered to him. And probably this story would have to have come from Peter, James, or John, or perhaps all three of them. Jesus was close enough to them that they could have seen the angel. Jesus returned to those three disciples, Peter, James, and John, twice, both times finding them asleep, and warning them concerning watching and praying, and told them something that we all know very well, and is in a way a very comforting scripture. In a way, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. At least we know that if we have the right spirit and we really, really want to serve God, we still have to struggle with the flesh sometimes. But it's good to know that we can have an attitude towards God and a relationship towards God, that our spirit is there with him, and we can trust him just like Jesus did here to help us with the things where the flesh is weak. This is in Matthew chapter 26 and Mark chapter 14. It's interesting that nothing is told about these other 8 disciples. This is when they were with Jesus in the room where they were having the Last Supper. Is the last thing we hear of them when they come into the garden, and he leaves them at a particular place and then goes on further with Peter, James, and John. We don't hear about these other disciples until after Jesus' resurrection. So Jesus finally comes back to Peter, James, and John, and he tells them, "Come on, let's be going. My hour is here." And so Judas, one of the 12 disciples, came to the garden where he knew Jesus would be praying. And my goodness, look what happens here. Look what he brought. With him was a Roman cohort of various priests. We don't know how many, and we don't know how many scribes and elders there were with them. And we know there were servants. So in fact, Matthew chapter 26, verse 47 says there was a large crowd, and they were carrying lanterns and torches and clubs and swords. Can you imagine that scene? Quite a scene, quite a dramatic scene out there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. Matthew chapter 26, Mark 14, and Luke chapter 22. The story of Judas really raises some interesting questions. Jesus can know all things, and he can know all things always ahead of time, but it does seem like that sometimes he doesn't. For example, We know one case where Jesus said that he did not know the day nor the hour when the end would come, only the Father. And so I don't know. I find it hard to believe that Jesus knew when he selected Judas to be one of the apostles. I find it hard to believe that he knew that Judas would betray him. But there came a time, sometime, and perhaps I think very late on. Uh, I don't know. I should have double checked, but I could well think maybe it didn't happen until Jesus didn't know till near the very end. And some suggest that Jesus dipping the sop with Judas at the Last Supper was a sincere effort on the part of Jesus uh, to reach out to Judas and perhaps change the course of these things. But we do know what happened. Judas did bring the crowd there, and he identified Jesus the way that he told them he would identify them, by giving him a kiss. And when Jesus told them that he was the one that they were seeking, they all fell backward to the ground, according to Matthew chapter 18, verses 5 through 6. And so, this is just so amazing in a way, and so interesting. I think maybe if I'd have been among that group and Jesus identified himself and something knocked me backward to the ground, I don't know but what I would have turned around and got out of there some way. But no, they're just going to press on here, and really, it's when you think about all the wonderful teachings that Jesus gave, and right before their eyes performing these healings, even this very week in the temple, all these healings, and how can they not understand? How can they not see that he is who he claims to be? It's just very difficult for us to comprehend this. But nevertheless, they didn't. And even though, it's very, very manifest that Jesus could have just blown them completely out of the water, and yet they stand right back up and proceed to go ahead with what they're planning to do. So it's really amazing, really amazing. All four Gospels uh, tell about Peter drawing his sword and cutting off the ear of Malchus, who Malchus was a servant of the high priest. Uh, I think the high priest was not in the group. He probably sent his servant, or maybe multiple ones of his servants, to go along with the other priests out there to arrest Jesus. But anyway, Malchus was one of the high priest's servants, and when Peter saw what was happening, he just drew his sword out and started swinging, and probably was swinging to cut the guy's head off, just to be honest. But probably the guy ducked, and so Peter lopped his ear off. And only Luke, the physician, tells that Jesus touched and healed the servant's ear. Can you imagine this? I don't. I don't know. It says that Peter cut his ear off. It didn't just say he cut it. It said he cut it off. And so, did Jesus touch him and he grew a new ear? Did Jesus reach down the ground and dust off his ear and wipe the blood off or something and just put it back up there? I don't know. But and once again, everybody there can see what's going on. They see Peter draw his sword and swing, and the guy's ear go flying, and then he's healed. What kind of a man is this? This Jesus? Well, we know he was the Son of God, but and why they couldn't get it and respond to that is a mystery to us. Matthew reports that Jesus rebuked Peter, said, "Peter, stop that." One of them says something almost exactly like that. "Peter, stop it." But in Jesus says something very interesting in his rebuke of Jesus. He says, "Do you not think that I can appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" How many of you believe that is true? Well, of course, we all believe that is true. But think about the significance of this. He tells Peter, if I want to right now, I could ask the Father, and he would put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels to take care of this situation. That uh, uh, that tells us what I have always believed, and that is when Jesus was praying back there in the garden, he said, "Father, is there some other way that we can do this?" Jesus had to yield his will to the Father, or this would not have happened. Jesus could have. It appears to me that Jesus could have said no. If he can say, I can call 12 legions of angels, then this would in effect be saying, no, Father, I don't want to do this. And he says the Father would be willing to do that. Very interesting. Very interesting. 12 legions of angels. Uh, Jesus chided the crowd for coming after him like they did, coming out there after him like he's some kind of thief, and he's never been guilty of stealing anything. The fact of the matter is he's never been guilty of breaking any law of any kind whatsoever. Now he broke some of the Sabbath quote unquote rules of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but they're coming out there at night uh, like he's a thief, and they're coming out there with weapons and a whole bunch of people. And he said, "Why are you coming after me like this?" Well, I was right there in the temple teaching and healing people openly in the temple day after day after day through the week, and you didn't do anything. Why come after me out here like I'm a thief? So uh, only Mark tells about a young man. Uh, this is another one of the interesting stories in here. Mark tells about a young man, and he says that he was completely naked except for a linen sheet covering him, and he was following Jesus. They seized him, but he left the sheet behind and fled. And many believe that this young man, most people, I think, most scholars believe that this young man was probably Mark himself, because uh, someone had to be an eyewitness of this, and it's quite possible that the disciples had fled by this time, although we don't know for sure. But this makes sense that it could well have been Mark, because some believe that the house where that Jesus and his disciples used for the Last Supper was Mark's house. Uh, Mary was his mother, and and they say that the linen sheet that he had was usually only something that someone who was relatively well off could afford. Otherwise, it would not be made out of linen. Uh, uh, and also that the family was probably pretty well to do, or they would not have had a room large enough for Jesus and his disciples on that at that time. But anyway, the young man, whoever it was, probably Mark, when they tried to grab a hold of him, he just slipped out of the sheet and left it behind, and the Bible says he ran away naked. And what I can believe is that Mark heard some of the going on, and when the disciples left, perhaps he was already ready for bed, but he just decided to grab this sheet right quick and follow them. And anyway, so Jesus was arrested, and just as he had said, his disciples all fled into the night. And so Jesus is led away, and he's put through these so-called trials. And I put that in quotation because they were not proper trials. but he was put before religious leaders and political officials. And all the Gospels give us various kinds of information. Matthew 26, Mark chapter 14, Luke 20 and 23, actually Mark chapter 15 also. And you notice that most of them use parts of a couple of chapters. John chapter 18, all four of the Gospels, of course, are going to record this information for sure. And according to John, they first took Jesus to Annas. Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas was the high priest. Annas had been the high priest, but at this time Caiaphas was. And notice the relationship here, father-in-law. And so Annas had a lot of influence over Caiaphas. And so John says that they took Jesus first to Annas, and then afterwards they took him to Caiaphas. All four Gospels tell about Peter following afar off and denying Jesus 3 times. Now this reminds me of another situation with Peter where they were out on the Lake of Galilee, and the storm was coming, and Jesus, they see him, and Peter says, "If it's you, bid me come to you, and I'll come walking on the water to you." And so Peter gets out of the boat and starts going, and sure enough, he starts sinking. Well, here we go again. We can criticize Peter here for denying the Lord, but guess what? He was at least one who was concerned enough to try to stay close enough to Jesus to see what was going on. And in doing so, he got himself into a situation, and as Jesus had told him would happen, he ended up denying Jesus 3 times. Only John, all four tell about this, but only John tells about, quote unquote, another disciple. And most believe that this was probably John. Also followed and let Peter into the courtyard, where he finally ended up around the fire warming himself. And it's just interesting, I think, that all four of the Gospels tell the story about Peter and denying the Lord, but only John gives this little bit of information. So it's probably pretty certain that the other disciple there was, in fact, John the Apostle. Judas felt remorse. He went back and tried to get the religious leaders to take the 30 pieces of silver back, and they wouldn't. So he went and threw it into the temple, and then he went out and hanged himself. And this story is told only by Matthew in chapter 27. And it's really interesting, as I said before, about Judas. It's really striking to me that there's nothing here at all about he had great remorse apparently, but there's nothing here about him trying to repent. I don't know, and I just have to believe that if he would have tried to repent, that Jesus would have received him back, just like he did Peter. But the devil had such a hold on Judas apparently that he felt no hope, and he went out and hanged himself. What a terrible end. What a terrible, terrible end. Only Luke in chapter 2 reports that they then took Jesus before the entire Sanhedrin. It's as I was reviewing for this and preparing for it, it just began to strike me the various things that are told only by one of the Gospels, and this is a very important one that is told only by Luke. During these trials, Jesus referred to himself on a number of occasions as the Son of Man. The Son of Man was Jesus' favorite title to refer to himself by, and he often avoided and sometimes even told people not to identify him as the Christ. And but here, during these trials, he referred to himself as the Son of Man, but he also acknowledged that he was, in fact, the Son of God in Luke chapter 23, the Christ in Mark chapter 14, and the King of the Jews in Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John chapter 18. So in his last hours here, Jesus acknowledged that he was the Messiah, that he was the King of the Jews, he was the Son of God. I am the Son of God, the Son of Man. And so he acknowledged all those messianic titles. They then took Jesus to Pilate, and only Luke tells that Pilate sent him to Herod, and then Herod, quizzed him, and then sent him back to Pilate. So now Jesus has been before Annas, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, Pilate, Herod, and now back to Pilate. Only Matthew, here's another one of those onlys. Only Matthew reports the incident with Pilate's wife. Pilate's wife got in touch with him while all this was going on, and she sent a message to him, and she says, don't you make any ruling against that righteous man. She told about a dream that she had, and a struggle that she had in that dream over this, and she warned her husband not to do what he was about to do. So I believe Pilate really did want to release Jesus, but he just couldn't stand up against the demands of the religious leaders and the crowd. So he had Jesus scourged and handed him over to be crucified, in spite of him saying over and over again that he found no fault in him. He found no fault in Jesus. He tried to get the crowd to be satisfied with him releasing Barabbas to them, but the religious leaders had the crowds all stirred up, and they cried out for Barabbas, as you know, instead of Jesus. And so, as I said, Pilate just simply did not have the backbone to stand up against the religious leaders in the crowd, and so he allowed Jesus to be scourged and turned him over to them for crucifixion. Well, we're going to have to close there for this time, and we look forward to the next thing coming up is Jesus' crucifixion. So I do hope that you will join me again next week, and of course this is extremely this is such an understatement, such an extremely important part of the story, and I know that it will be a blessing to you. So we're looking forward to having you back with us again next week. In the meantime, go with God, and the Lord bless you.